All right, I think we might as well start because we have some preliminary things to say and not a small amount of things to say as we begin. So again, welcome to those of you who are here. This is the Vermont version of the Solve Climate by 2030 campaign, which is brought to you by the Bard Center for Environmental Policy, led by my good friend, Eben Goodstein. This is the second year that Eben and his colleagues at Bard have organized a series of webinars to promote the idea that at the local level, at the state level, even at the country level, one should think about solutions at scale to get us to where we need to be by 2030. Greenhouse gas emissions will not be gone by 2030, but the idea is that we are on our way in terms of having infrastructure and policy, and to quote our Middlebury colleague, the zeitgeist, quoting Bill McKibben, to get the world where it needs to be with the urgency that we know we need. It's a real honor to participate in this. And in a moment, I will introduce our panelists, who are Joanna Miller, the Energy and Climate Program Director of the Vermont Natural Resources Council, Cara Robeck, who's the Network Manager for the Energy Action Network, and Kate Holly, a senior at Middlebury College and a sustainability consultant and writer. You'll be learning from them in a moment. And you all, now about 35 strong, are a range of Vermonters, students, faculty members, high school teachers, college teachers, scientists, concerned citizens. And so we welcome you all. We look forward to hearing from you. About 45 minutes into this 90-minute program, we will be answering what questions you may have, what comments you may have for the second part of this session. And the way we ask you to do that is not through the chat, but rather through the Q&A, which since we're now all Zoom pros, you can see probably to the lower right of your Zoom screen. So as you listen, certainly as we get into that phase, feel free to offer questions and we'll do our best to discuss them and answer them. As I mentioned, the real leader for this effort is Dr. Eben Goodstein, who is an economist by trade and who over a decade ago started the Center for Environmental Policy at Bard. I've known Eben since I started at Middlebury over 2 decades ago. And here's the thing about him. He has been on the forefront of what we now call the climate movement from the very beginning. So for example, he was training volunteers to show PowerPoint slides about climate science long before Al Gore was doing it. He had a project, and that was something called the Greenhouse Network. He had a project called Focus the Nation, which was trying to rally college students and others, even as 350.org was building out. So Eben's always been there, somewhat of a first mover, and always a very inspiring figure in the climate movement. So I am honored now to share a brief video from Eben, and this unites the well over 100 webinars that are happening around the world and in all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico. And so I'm honored to share that with you as we get started. As the technology allows. All right, here we go.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 US states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eben Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness. Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the 2 hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon neutral economy, while the US rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinar's homework for the students and then afterwards have a 1-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy to use teachers' guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forward, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
Well, thank you, Eben, for your good work. And as a reminder of both the urgency and the framing of justice, which is really the right way to go. As we begin, I have on my mind really 3 aspects of that as to how it looks from sitting in Vermont. One is COVID and what we've been through, as Eben just talked us through, and the truth that it is the most vulnerable folks who have suffered the most from COVID, and that calls all of us to act. I think too of the land we're on, and knowing that indigenous people long before European people came along used this land with their own wisdom and power and leadership, And I will say that Middlebury College is just beginning to come to terms with the fact that we're on Abenaki land. And that's a promising part of our work, but also a long overdue recognition of injustice that has really pervaded the space that we're in now. And then I think too of Black Lives Matter, and as Eben said, that movement, which at its best is integrating with the climate movement and the others. Here we are tonight, mourning the loss of Dante Wright, knowing that the trial of the killer of George Floyd is ongoing. We think of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and others. I'll speak for myself that I have been profoundly influenced by the folks who have led Black Lives Matter and have learned, above all from students, how to integrate those visions and that hard work and that honesty into the good work that we've done for a long time in environmental studies. So I'm thankful for those leaders, but also mourning the loss of too many good people. With that as an introduction, I am honored to be able to note that our three panelists, who are now going to come to you via the magic of Zoom, are eager to share their perspectives. And I am very happy to be the moderator to bring out what they can teach us. Our format will be a kind of modified panel, as dynamic and sort of informal as we can, but recognizing that Kate and Cara and Joey, particularly as we start, will want to lay the groundwork for our conversation about solutions and how Vermont's going to get there. And so that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to start with Kate. I've known Kate Holly for 3 years as a Middlebury student, the first 2 years of which were just being thankful to the good work she did at the Franklin Environmental Center at Hillcrest. Now I had the honor of being in a class with her, our senior seminar on community engaged practicum, in which she's leading one of 3 projects, and that all of you will hear more about as we go forward. Kate is a senior, graduating soon, has shown great fortitude as she has just gotten her second vaccine and is still with us. So Kate, I would love to hear you to say hello to the people with us. And also, if I may ask, to share something you wrote about very profoundly in our class, which is hope, and where you sit in terms of 2021, having been in Vermont for a while, looking to the future. How does hope sit with you, and how can we all grapple with the need for hope, even as we recognize the challenges that we have in this world right now?
Thank you, John, for that introduction. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really tough being in the academic world of environmental studies, because you are constantly hit with the reality of climate science and climate change. And in some ways, like, it can be rather debilitating to hear all the facts, and to also feel like we're kind of trapped in these 4 years, like we're trapped here and we are just like waiting to get out into like the quote unquote real world, and like start moving things, start making real change. But you know, it can be really stressful and just overwhelming to get caught up in the doom and gloom. But I would say, like, despite all of that, I still have a lot of hope. And, you know, a lot of that is a product of me being in Vermont, where I'm, you know, originally from Chicago, came to Vermont for college, and it's a very different environment. And I would say, like, Vermont, one of its big things is that it's a community, and a strong community is one that like is going to act together and in unison. And so one of the articles that we read, John, was the one by the journalist Isabel Wilkerson, and she is talking about this, and she compares America to an old house, and she's saying, like, this is an old house and there's just so much work that needs to be done. But But what's key is that she's saying that we inherited this house and we are like the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. And I think that that's so critical because really, like, we are all responsible. Every one of us has a stake in this. And I kind of took that analogy of the house and said, okay, well, Vermont is one room in this house. And we are now tasked with just repairing this one room. And because of this like strong Vermont community, like, we're not alone. And I think, a community is as strong as the commitments its members have towards one another and those bonds they have formed. And that's very unique to Vermont. I feel like there's this closeness in which, Vermonters recognize each other and they know each other and they care about one another. And like that level of neighborliness and familiarity, I think really just runs throughout the state. And that really is a demonstration of Vermont and it's like our commitment to the Vermont community. And I think in that, like, I find it very encouraging and like for us to kind of recognize the value of our neighbors and the relationships we have with one another, because the climate movement is collaborative. And, if we're taking this communal action, that there's so much hope in that, because I think that's where we can start to kind of work in getting this just transition, if you will. In part because we're working together, but like especially because we are trying not to leave anyone behind. Because like as a community, we are one. So like that includes, the Vermont farmers, the educators, students, brewers, policymakers, like all of those people, like they're all equal members of the Vermont community, regardless of whether you're like me and moved here for college or whether you've been here for generations. And I just think that there's a ton of hope in recognizing that we are a community and thinking, okay, well, where can we all come together and like, what can we do?
Fabulous. Thank you, Kate, for getting us started so beautifully. You mentioned Isabel Wilkerson. It is very powerful what we read together in our class, an excerpt from her masterpiece, Caste, which tells the story of race in this country in a way that compares it, as you know, to caste in India, even to how folks thought about the social ranking in the run-up to Nazi Germany. It's a powerful, disturbing, and eye-opening book, which calls, as we've been reading about and thinking about in our class, for radical empathy. That's her solution. And after we circle through hearing from Cara and Joey now, with your blessing, Kate, I'd love to give an example of that, which I heard earlier today, the good work you're doing with migrant workers in Addison County on our dairy farms. And it was very powerful what you shared, the work you're doing with 3 students under the guidance of our colleague Diane Monroe and myself. So if we can hold on to that as a topic to come back to, that would be great. Thank you so much for that opening. Cara, talk to us how that room in this house that Kate alluded to looks from your perspective. Give us a sense, if you will, of what EAN does, what you do there, and how we should think about the state of the state and where we're going.
I would love to. I'm going to share a few slides, which I think you can see now. So my name is Cara Robeck. I am the network manager at Energy Action Network. And just to give a very quick overview of what Energy Action Network is, we are a diverse collection of organizations, businesses, utilities, colleges, and universities, and lots of organizations across Vermont that all come together to try to make progress on our climate goals. We also have a small nonprofit that serves to support this diverse network of organizations and public partners. So it's just a visual of some of our members and our public partners. Our mission is to achieve Vermont's climate and energy commitments in ways that create a more just, thriving, and sustainable future for Vermonters. So that gets really, for me, to the heart of what we are talking about here today. And one of the things that Energy Action Network does is that we collect the data and information, and we share that out to help our members and public partners to make really good information that's based in that data. So I'm going to share some data and some graphs with you. I won't take a whole lot of time about it, but I think that it's really important to have that as the basis of our conversation as we talk about how we want to move forward. So when I talk about Vermont's climate and energy commitments, we now have a legal commitment through the Global Warming Solutions Act to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to do that really fast. So the message today is that we need to solve climate issues by 2030. There's a really massive decrease in greenhouse gas emissions that we need to make by 2030 and continue on through 2050 in order to make the changes that we need to make. And we need to do this across all of the sectors where we have greenhouse gas emissions: transportation, thermal, electricity, etc. So when we're looking at solutions, it's good to know the scale of the problem. About 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the energy sector, with the biggest amount of those coming from the transportation sector, followed by building thermal, heating and cooling our buildings, and then agriculture, electric generation, industrial processes, and waste management. So when we look at the scale of the issue, it's good to know, okay, where are we looking for solutions? Where are the problems coming from? And I would also say that the energy picture is complicated. So for example, we use the most energy for heating and cooling our buildings, but that's not where the highest emissions come from. We actually have higher emissions coming from our transportation sector, and we're spending more money on transportation. So, you can look at how you're producing, how much energy you're using. You can look at where the emissions are coming from, and you can look at the dollars that are being spent on the energy. And all of those are relevant when you're trying to decide how to make policies, how to make sure that there are fair and just and equitable solutions for all Vermonters. So back to this slide again. Is it possible, right? Is it possible to get where we need to go by 2030? It is the short answer, but it's not easy. So one of the things that EAN has done recently is we've developed a emissions reduction model to help illustrate a pathway that we could take to get to our goals. It's not the only the choices that we could make that would get us to our goals, but it is one illustration of a way that we could get there. And this is just a few of the things that we would need to do to scale up to getting to the emissions reductions that we need to get to. So as one example, we would need to go from, the 4,000 EVs we had in 2018 to 60,000 EVs in 2025, 190,000 EVs in 2030. We need to be using alternate commutes, car sharing, busing. We need to increase biofuels in our mix. We need more efficient vehicles. We need heavy duty bus electrification. So we need all of these. We need this whole package. Or if we decide, well, we're not going to do one of these, then we need to replace it with something else, because it's a package altogether that's going to get us to our emissions reductions. And I do want to note that this slide is labeled with a draft because we are in the final process of finishing our report for 2021. And I didn't want to bring out the 2019 numbers, but the 2021 report will be out fairly soon. There may be some minor modifications in that report. But, we've done similar work with thermal energy. What is it going to take to heat and cool our homes and reduce emissions at the same time? And we need to scale up very, very quickly on all of these solutions if we're going to get to our end goals. I also want to point out, because equity and getting there together in ways that are fair and just are really important to all of us, I think. So it's important to note that low-income Vermonters purchase a lot less energy than upper-income Vermonters, but spend a far greater proportion of their income on energy. So this is really important. Whenever we're designing policies, whenever we're coming up with new programs that are going to address energy issues, we need to make sure that we're keeping our lower-income neighbors in mind, and that we are designing programming that's going to benefit everyone and not just the people who can pay to get the new EV or to install the cold climate heat pump or whatever the measure is. We need to be designing around that. I also wanted to point out that there's good news in terms of a lot of the solutions that we are modeling, in that most of the ways that we would model reducing our emissions also keep more of the dollars that we're spending on energy in our state. So when we go from driving a car that uses fossil fuels or heating our house with fossil fuels to doing more with electricity or wood, more of the dollars that we spend stay in state, and they provide employment for our neighbors and, you know, our community members, rather than just sending all of that money out of state on fossil fuels that we probably don't really want to be spending the money on anyway. So that is a very, very, very brief overview, because I want this to be mostly a conversation. We will be putting our new progress report for Vermont out, hopefully next month, possibly June. It'll be May or June, and we'd be very happy to send that out when we have it. But I look forward to having more of a conversation about a little bit of this information.
You know, Cara, that was just so timely, and I challenge any other state doing Solve Climate to have such a succinct and well-researched set of pathways to get to 2030, as daunting as it is, to put it mildly. And you all are really remarkable, not only for the network you have, the research you do, but also the way you present the data, which is really so beautifully done. So hats off to you. We'll circle back to you, Cara, of course, as we go forward, dig into some of those sectors. I know we want to hear in particular about transportation and the challenges and possibilities there. But before we do that, Joey, we'll hear from you as we got started and we're preparing in the minutes before 7 o'clock. You said you love to come in and in the wake of the EAN presentations and then kind of offer your thoughts on their wonderful overview. And so we just saw that. And so from where you sit with the VNRC and the good work you've been doing there for so many years, talk to us about solving climate by 2030. What is to be done?
Thanks, John. And indeed, I'd love to follow on the heels of my friends and colleagues at the Energy Action Network for the very reasons you articulated. And I'm pretty sure that I would have a better day and more success in the hard work if I also started my day with Kate and the positive frame that you just laid out there. So I just want to thank you for that and the context that you laid out, because I really feel that hope, and I really appreciate the, you know, sort of the things that you identified as the opportunities that Vermont has in terms of our community and our still working democracy and our connections to each other. So I fundamentally agree, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Let me just spend a few minutes saying a few things. So yeah, I'm Johanna Miller, Joey. I run the Energy and Climate Program at the Vermont Natural Resources Council. We're a member-based environmental advocacy organization based here in Montpelier. We have been around for almost 60 years, and we have 4 programs, a water program, a sustainable communities program, a forest and wildlife, and a climate and energy program, which I lead. And, you know, all of these issues are deeply interconnected, and we've been doing this work for a long time, and we do our work founded on 2 primary things, which is deep collaboration and coalition building, because to move, you know, towards a sustainable future, we need the partnership of a lot of different people and a lot of different diverse perspectives. And we do a lot of work at the local level. One of the privileges I have is helping to coordinate Vermont's statewide network of town energy committees. I see a few community energy committee leaders on the call this evening. There, about half of the towns in the state of Vermont have these all volunteer grassroots groups that are partnering with their municipalities and helping to reduce the fossil fuels that we import every drop of, as Cara noted, massive hemorrhage in our economy, and really focusing on the solutions, helping their friends, neighbors, and the municipalities themselves transition to a clean energy economy. And so I really get a lot of inspiration from that network, those community leaders embedded in their communities. That's at the heart of the community that you're talking about, I think, Kate. So I just say a few more things. As Cara noted, we have a long way to go to achieve the pollution reductions that to do our part on the climate crisis here in the state of Vermont. And we have a lot at stake. I mean, as you noted, John, as Eben noted, we have about a decade to cut our collective global greenhouse gas emissions in half, or, risk catastrophic consequential consequences of climate change. And what we also know is that, the business as usual is really harming the most vulnerable and people of color first and worst. So this is a deep inequity issue globally. It is also the same here in Vermont. The economic inequity that Cara shared, but also deep other, sort of inequities related to who is harmed. And this is where I think I'm really excited about the opportunity we have before us, and I'm happy to talk more about it, which is Vermont has had greenhouse gas emission reduction goals on the books since 2005. We've made a little bit of progress in the electric sector. We're on target to reduce our emissions and clean up our electric grid. And that wasn't by accident. That was by good public policy and sort of political support and public support for cleaning up the way we power our lives. But again, as Cara noted, this is why I love to follow on the Energy Action Network's heels. We have a lot more to do in the transportation and building and thermal sector in particular, and we are not done in the electric sector at all. And the piece of it that I get excited about is that we have a tremendous economic opportunity putting people to work in well-paying jobs here in the state of Vermont, keeping more money in our state, recirculating in our economy. And there's a huge equity opportunity in shaping the programs and the policies and the initiatives that are going to help people reduce their reliance on fossil fuels and do our part on climate. So I really like to think about this transition in the opportunity frame and the sort of the benefits that we know, including public health benefits and jobs benefits and economic benefits and equity benefits from a strategic transition. And now we have a new required commitment in the Global Warming Solutions Act to make really significant reductions by 2025, 2030, and 2050. And we have a new climate council that's being stood up, a 23-member climate council and 5 subcommittees that are going to inform the work to draft a plan to come up with a roadmap to get to those targets in a strategic, equitable way. And that work is nascent, but getting underway. And I think it's a really important framework to drive the transformation that's required. And that's going to really require the partnership of a lot of different players, people like you. And again, I'm going to lean more heavily, if I can, on Kate and others for the inspiration about the why we can do this, because it's been a slog, as you noted a little bit, John. We've made some progress here in Vermont. We have a lot of public support for making this transition, but we have a lot more room to go. And so now we have this new framework in place, a foundation upon which to build. And that's where I'm really looking forward to hearing input from folks tonight on where we should be focusing and what we can be doing to not just focus on the costs and consequences of taking action, but on the benefits, the opportunities, and how we can do this well, but do it.
Yeah. And it's remarkable, isn't it, Joey? And I know you've seen this for so many years with great patience, that we finally have at the federal level leaders in the White House who, it seems, understand the urgency as well as one could hope, and who are willing to use fiscal and other measures in ways we have not seen in this country in decades, since the New Deal and LBJ. One thinks of the war on poverty, the mobilization of federal resources, the commitment to a certain kind of spending, which is really remarkable. We had Jesse Jenkins visit our class a couple of weeks ago, and for those of you who are listening and you want to really be in touch with and learn from a scientist who studies energy in every corner of the challenges, Jesse Jenkins, Jesse Jenkins, is at Princeton, and he joined our class 2-3 weeks ago, and really in his own way was very hopeful, but was sharing the truth that we can do this, but it does require this massive mobilization. As Bill McKibben said a decade or so ago, it's not like getting a man to the moon. It's like getting 10,000 people to the moon. But we hear that kind of commitment now, finally. The COVID money coming into the Vermont now can do some of that. And certainly if this infrastructure bill passes with the fragile majority in the Senate and the House, that would be, real resources to do this. Does that, Joanna, so I'm going to ask you before we circle back to Kate and hear a bit more about the good work she's doing alongside students. Let me ask you a question that I asked Jesse. Is this the time we've been waiting for? I mean, it was a hypothetical when we started talking about a climate movement in the early part of the first decade of this millennium. Is this it? Are we on the verge of that mobilization that we hoped for, but perhaps in our hearts weren't sure if it was possible?
Oh gosh, I hope so. I mean, I think I think the hope is worthy. I mean, President Biden has surrounded himself by a strong team of climate leaders, and he's, put forward really important, ambitious ideas related to climate action, centering equity, putting people to work, doing things like, modeling the Civilian Conservation Corps, putting out like a proposal for a climate corps, which I feel very honored to say that we are working with a team of Middlebury students looking at the opportunity of, could Vermont stand up some version of a recovery jobs corps, a climate corps? I mean, we have, probably the biggest economic opportunity we have at our fingertips is to get off of the fossil fuels that we all collectively use and put people to work in deep efficiency and deep clean electrification and, in agriculture and in food systems innovations and all kinds of different things. So I feel very hopeful that this is a moment, but we can't take our foot off the bicycle pedal as we really focus on really making sure that we don't squander this fragile moment, as you said, because the political moment we're in is tenuous, and that's where we need to, I would, just say that sort of leadership we need to celebrate, support, and continue to build. And that starts again at the very local level too, which I celebrate the network of town energy committees. And those are the folks who are doing the hard work in the trenches and moving folks like that up the leadership ladder so that they're running for local office, they're running for state office, we're getting good people elected. Like, we have a moment in time, and let us hope that we do not squander it.
Yeah. No, well put. And I'm sure that the foot that you mentioned on the bicycle, that's an electric bicycle.
Oh, sure is.
Solar panels, we trust, and can get through a Vermont winter without a doubt. Awesome. I would be remiss to not put in a plug for a Middlebury alum who's at the heart of this conversation in the White House, and that's Brian Deese, class of 00. He's the director of the National Economic Council, which means he's essentially at the top of the pyramid in terms of economic policy there, and has put climate at the center of that. Many of you are fans of the podcast of Ezra Klein, who now is doing his work through the New York Times. And about a week ago, he had his second interview with Brian, but this one is focused on this very issue. And I commend it to you. You can Google it and listen for 50 minutes or so, and you'll hear Brian, no doubt because of the great education he got at Middlebury, laying out the urgency and how the administration hopes to do it. So scale matters, and certainly that scale matters. Kate, I want to pick up on community, and then in due course, we're going to start to field some questions and bring in the ongoing expertise that you all are bringing in. But you mentioned community as a kind of foundation for hope. We academics sometimes use this word social capital, and what you shared with us this morning so well in a class meeting is the challenge and the possibilities of building trust. And I wondered if you would share efficiently with folks here the work you're doing with migrant workers and dairy farmers and the housing project you're on, but also focus on how you all are learning about the importance of building trust, and how the massive social change that we're now considering, in essence, it can't be done without it. That building community is work, it's daily work, and I think what you're doing is a good illustration of that. So if you would summarize that to our good people here, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So myself, alongside 3 other students, we are working with the Farm Labor Housing Initiative that's partnering with this program called Milk with Dignity. And the whole goal is to provide farmers, migrant farm workers, with energy efficient homes. So they're net zero modular homes. And so working on improving those living conditions for migrant farm workers in Vermont, specifically those participating with this program called Milk with Dignity that works to establish a code of conduct, I suppose, for dignified working standards for these farms. And so part of our work is involves interviewing, more like having conversations with certain migrant farm workers that we've connected with. And I would say, like, John, like you mentioned, radical empathy, and like that's a theme that like our class keeps coming back to, and it's radical empathy is about like putting in the work to listen. And so for us, that's putting in the work to like to know how, or begin to understand how the migrant workers are feeling, not how we imagine they would feel. And you know, what's that require? It's about sitting down and having conversations, and really building that trust, where we are, you know, not talking at them, but we are conversing with them and listening like with our full hearts. And that's just so critical because, like we were talking about, like trust, you know, this trust isn't going to happen overnight. Our project, you know, we only have weeks left in the semester. So, you know, it's a real challenge to think about, okay, how do we navigate building sufficient trust to the point where they are comfortable, you know, conversing with us and telling us, you know, what's on their mind with respect to this project. And I would say like a big part of that for us is like taking off our student hats. And by that, I mean like not assuming that, you know, we know everything because we read some articles about it or we studied it in class, and really just, you know, actually putting that aside and saying, okay, well, you know, the people we are talking with, they are going to relate to those issues more because that's their lived experience. So if we want to effectively engage with people outside of our smaller, like Middlebury College community, we need to kind of separate, kind of like pull ourselves out of this like student, like academic world almost, and instead place ourselves as members of a shared community. And I'd say like one example of that really briefly is like, so we're working with Peter Schneider, who's with Efficiency Vermont, and his work is also helping to provide those zero energy modular homes to the migrant farm workers. And my group, we're looking at, okay, well, you know, what might be some key architectural design considerations for these homes? And, you know, we can sit there all day and speculate about, you know, what might be good, what might be needed based on any like pictures we've seen, or other research. But what good is it if we don't actually hear from the people who will be receiving those homes? And so, for example, 2 group members of mine, Kat and Mateo, they recently interviewed one of the migrant farm workers, and they found that like one of the wants was for a room to have a TV where they can watch the soccer game and not have to worry about it being too loud for the other people in another room. That's something that evidently was very important to him, but like that might not have come up if we hadn't had that conversation. And if we, we're really focusing on not like imposing our own ideas on them. And I would say, you can apply that framework outside of migrant farm workers, and going back to this idea of community, are we listening to every member of our community? Cara, like you said earlier, like, who's at the table when we're designing policies? Are we inviting low-income Vermonters to this discussion? Are people of color included? In my opinion, it's really about paying attention to who isn't there, which can be, it's hard to do, but really making an effort to bring them in as stakeholders, because again, we all have a stake in this. And I think like we can learn something from everyone, but we just have to be willing to listen and put in the work to listen, and do so with open hearts and open minds. And I think in that way, you're going to be building that sense of community, and that's what's going to be at the foundation of this just transition.
Nice. No, beautifully put. Thanks. And I think of something that we did as a class, which was to listen to the first in a series called Color Lines in the Green Mountains. And this is a new project from Cara Morris, who many of you know was an elected representative in the Vermont Senate, and who resigned because of untoward pressure from people down in southern Vermont where she lives, and all of it with a deeply racial element to it. Very disturbing episode in a state that, as you say, Kate, is known for community and understanding. And recently, you can find this on YouTube, she interviewed the outgoing head of the Rutland NAACP, Tabitha Moore. And about 2/3 of the way through that interview, which you can find on YouTube, Tabitha Moore just very strongly echoes what you just said, Kate. She said, she was speaking for where she sits as an African-American Vermonter. She said, we don't want to just be invited to the table kind of late in the game, give some answers, and then being sort of asked to leave the table. It doesn't work that way. And the kind of listening and the quiet that comes from really engaging with folks of all kinds has to start from day one. And it's a really good series that Kaya has started, and I commend it to all of you. And maybe it's a nice transition to our Q&A as we open it up to the good folks with us. Bill asks, what can an individual do right now? And it strikes me that we just heard that one thing is to slow down, to listen, to engage, and to have that kind of open heart, and Kate, as you put so nicely. So thanks for that. I'm going to scan now the Q&A. So as I do that and sort of take the moderator's prerogative to bring some of these in, Cara and Joey, I want to give you an opportunity just to reflect on what we just heard from Kate, and or offer anything before we actively get into the Q&A that you think should be said right now, as we're about halfway through our program.
Well, just pivoting right off of something, what you just said, Kate, and what you noted in terms of John, what Kaya Morris, I would say when I mentioned the new Climate Council being stood up and the subcommittees, a requirement of this new law is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions pretty significantly by 2025, 2030, and 2050. It also has very clear parameters around how, and that's really important. And some of that work is being done in the how related to equity in the Just Transitions subcommittee, which Kaya Morris is one of the co-chairs of that subcommittee. So this is a really important venue where they are currently deep in the work of crafting principles that will overlay over the Climate Council's work broadly, the subcommittee's work specifically, and the recommendations that will come out in the first Climate Action Plan in December of 2021. And ideally and obviously in the ensuing policymaking, program development, rulemaking, and public engagement that's going to need to accompany this moment as we craft a plan, and ensuing, conversations and program design and development over the course of time. I mean, so that's really important. And I look at it and I'm hopeful about it because it's operationalizing a focus on climate required to do that with a really core element founded in the principles of strong public engagement that really does things differently in the way that Kate, you are articulating so beautifully. So I think that's really hopeful. And I really encourage people to just follow the work of the Climate Council. And ideally there will be, very clear ways and surgical ways to weigh in on both the recommendations that we should be and the strategies we should be embracing, but also to inform the how, and really to ensure that we bring people into those conversations who may not be aware that they're happening and who may not, and so we're going to work to create strategies to bring people to the table in a way that we have never done so before.
Awesome. Picking up on that, and any of our panelists, feel free to jump in. There are some really wonderful questions here, so now we have an opportunity to address some of them and bring others into our conversation. So I think picking up, Joey, on what you were just saying about the kind of legislative and statewide strategy that VNRC and EAN and others have championed for so long, Alan Coulter has a question, which is this: how are you interacting with the folks formulating a climate action plan and a comprehensive energy plan at the Vermont legislature? Is it your impression that they are making progress? I suspect Joey and Cara, a little something about that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Do you want to start, Cara?
You're more involved in the climate action plan, so why don't you go first?
Well, I mean, I would say that I'm deeply involved in the Climate Council. I'm one of the 23 appointed members that comprise that council. I have filled the role of the environmental rep, which is a big role considering how broad and necessarily diverse the environmental movement is in the state of Vermont and worldwide. So the comprehensive energy plan, as people know, that sets a 90 by 2050 total renewable energy goal. So that means by the year 2050, 90% of our heating, transportation, and power sector should be renewable. There's a public process underway to update that plan. And then there's the climate action plan. And these processes are running parallel and they will intertwine. And there will be public engagement opportunities for folks in both of those arenas, and ideally some coordination so that they are ultimately, pushing towards the same goal, and so that people with limited time but who have passion and ideas for what we should be doing can weigh in. And I would then also say those processes have been enabled by statute and by the legislature, and so the legislature sort of, in their accountability role and in their policymaking role, or they're watching, I believe, those public processes play out. I know the House Energy and Technology, for example, which helped to lift the Global Warming Solutions Act over the line. Last week, they took testimony from the, which I would recommend to anyone, and I can drop it in the chat here if it's helpful, with a very broad overview of what's happening at the Climate Council, their charge, and how they're going to organize their work towards the December 2021 plan and beyond. So there's a lot happening in this moment. And the federal funding that you mentioned, John, I think is also a very active conversation about how we use those dollars to keep people healthy and fed and meet emergency needs, but then also potentially use some of those dollars to invest in ourselves and to invest in foundational things like climate strategies that are going to set us up for a more, sort of just a more sustainable way of living and operating, an affordable way of living and operating in the world. So there's so much happening in this moment. And it also is also very challenging in some ways to do this work and to be connected, to have that community cohesion that you spoke so beautifully about, Kate, because we're all in boxes. But as we start to, I feel like things are going to change, and there's so much like opportunity in all the stuff that is happening. So I can share more with you, John, later if there's links if people want to get more engaged.
No, that's great, Joanna, and a real call for folks to get involved with our legislature and the great and others like you up in Montpelier. And one of the great things about being a small state is that we can do that. Fran Putnam, who we have here with us and who was one of our panelists last year, personifies that citizen leadership. Fran has a question, but before we get to that, I have a twofold question, which comes from Sally Burrell and then our friends at the Springfield UU Meeting House. And I think, Cara, this could be a good one for you. And this is a really specific one. Sally's wondering about electric mowing. Mowers aren't regulated. They spew dirtier emissions. What's up with that? And then Springfield folks are noting that there's a lot of evidence that healthy soils and forests reduce CO2. Talk to us about those coalitions. And in particular, again, people who are starting to say, well, wait a minute, aren't we mowing too much, and isn't the mowing we do pretty dirty, and something should be done? How does that look, Cara? Do you think about the data you're looking at and the technologies? Is that something that's on the front burner for you all?
I wouldn't say it's something that's on the front burner. It's definitely something that we are aware of. And, you know, I know that there are people who are pushing for electric mowers and electric lawn technologies, and that there's a lot of proven technologies out there already. One of the things we have talked a lot about is that the time to make changes is when at the point of purchase, right? So it doesn't, you know, if you're talking about policies and you're just wanting to increase the pricing of fuels, that, you know, that can be really harmful for folks. You have to be thinking about that point of purchase. So what is it that makes someone walk into a store when they need a new lawnmower and think, oh, I want the electric version rather than the gas version? And so I think we're thinking more along that lines, like what are those pieces, whether those are like financial incentives or whether those are communication, and just making sure that people have the right information at the right time when they need to make those changes. So yes, it's definitely something that we're aware of. It's not something we're pushing on, you know, organizationally very hard at the moment. And in relation to the other question, which I think was really about some carbon sequestration as well as reducing emissions, we want to be thinking about sequestering carbon. And again, that's not something that Energy Action Network works on that much. We're very focused on that 80% of our emissions that come from the energy sectors. But I have huge amount of respect for the organizations that they name here and the work that they are doing on, you know, a healthy landscape as well.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks a lot. And I will say, for those who can, a great technology for keeping lawns and sumac and other things at bay is goats. And it's a lot nicer to have goats wandering around one's property than big pieces of technology that spew emissions. So maybe there's some hope in that. I mentioned Fran Putnam, and many of you listening know Fran and her husband Spence, who are always on the forefront of the right kind of social change. And I've been honored to work with them alongside Diane Monroe in environmental studies on one of their many projects, the most recent being Vision for Vermont, trying to bring Vermonters together to do exactly what we're trying to do with some specificity. So Fran, is a shout out to you, and it's so good you're here. You have a question for Kate, and I think we can put it in even broader perspective. But Kate, here you go. Have you considered staying in Vermont after graduation to give us the benefit of your education and experience and energy? If so, have you found that jobs are available in the environment, climate justice field that you can apply for in Vermont? So as you answer, if I may, Kate, can you also just sort of give your sense as it is of what the labor market looks like for good folks like you getting into it who want to do right by the world, what seems to be available, what should be available. And we might in time be able to relate this to the work that other students are doing this spring on building out a climate core. So talk to us a little bit, not only about your plans, which if you're going to leave the state, there's going to be a collective sigh, but also how you think that looks more generally from where you sit.
Sure. So yeah, I have thought about staying in Vermont because I love it here. When I came to Vermont to visit Middlebury, that was the first time I had ever been on the East Coast, and I just absolutely loved Vermont. And it's because of that ethic of care and that community and that familiarity that really draws me here. And I haven't looked at many jobs recently because I actually started my current job as a sustainability consultant back in January. So I'm still working part-time for that now, and I'll go back full-time after I graduate. But it's actually fully remote, so I can be anywhere, which is super exciting. And I'm thinking about bopping around the country for a little bit, but I'm definitely hoping to spend more time in Vermont because I go back to community all the time, but for me, especially knowing that I'm going to, not have an office space because I am remote, it's going to be about, okay, well, what organizations am I going to be working with? Where might I volunteer? How am I actually going to, find my community? And Vermont is just a very comforting place for me in that respect. And so I'm definitely hoping to spend some more time here in Vermont. Not sure if it'll be right after I graduate, but I do want to come back. And yeah, I know there are a lot of great groups throughout the state with respect to environmental science and environmental studies. I know up in Burlington, I'm thinking of Efficiency Vermont. I believe we also have the Nature Conservancy here as well. And a lot of those places are places where I know a lot of college students like to go there, and especially students from Vermont that they like to stay in state, which I think is really special. John, to your question about what seems to be available or what should be available, I'll answer the latter, what should be available. I would hope to, and I would love to see a lot of jobs in the environmental justice sphere, ones that are integrating racial and social justice with into their mission, and tying that in with environmental studies, because I think that that's something so important. That's not shying away from how interrelated the environmental movement is with the racial and social justice movement, and it's about not isolating those issues. Everything that we are doing when we're acting through an environmental lens, I would argue, should be done holding racial and social justice in mind as we go about. So that's what I would love to see, more jobs in that realm. I don't know the reality of it because I haven't been looking lately, but yeah, that's one of my hopes.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for sharing. And yeah, that prospect of you traveling the country a bit in what will certainly be an EV, but then making your way back here, we're all for it. Joey, quickly on the climate core issue and kind of the labor market, and picking up on what Kate said, how's that looking from your end? I mean, if we think of Cara's extraordinary modeling there, within a decade, there's a lot of heat pumps to put in and a lot of installation to do. I mean, in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Who's going to do that? How do we make sure they're well paid? Talk to us about how that's looking from where you sit.
Well, I mean, I think mean, you noted it and Kate did too. I mean, the transformation that we need to make worldwide and in Vermont in general is massive. We need to help our existing, our fuel providers and our network of more traditional energy companies transition into becoming more energy service providers, and to help young people like Kate and others who want to work in a hopeful space and be part of the solution. We're going to need, I mean, the state of Vermont, one of our fastest growing job sectors has been the clean energy job sector. And that's primarily been, as Kate said, through Efficiency Vermont. It's been through our efficiency commitments, and it's been through the clean energy sector. And that is, that's the solar sector largely. So the efficiency and solar sector, we have a lot of people working in that space. We've ratcheted down on the number of solar energy jobs because we've changed the policy framework. So I'm just going to sort of intercede here to say that my bias and part of the work that we do at the Vermont Natural Resources Council is to advocate for policies that, really require the kinds of that require, like in the energy and climate space, that are going to drive the transformation that we need, and that we can design policies in ways that are progressive, that center equity, and that we can identify where the benefits go and work with folks to make sure that they are identifying who is first served and where the benefits go. And so we don't have similar policies in the transportation and thermal space. We don't have any levers to pull in the transportation and thermal space in the way that we do in the clean electricity space. We have required progress in the electric sector. We have not required the same in the liquid fuel sector. And so we're going to need a supportive framework in place. Like you mentioned, John, now we have a partner in the federal government, again, who recognizes the obligation related to the climate urgency, the need for an equitable transition, and the massive job creating opportunity we have to attract and retain people like Kate here in the state of Vermont. And Kate, by golly, I hope you stay or come back. The Vermont Natural Resources Council is great, and there are lots of other great people too, and partners. But we just have a massive opportunity before us, but we're going to need the frameworks in place that really enable it. And we're going to, and that requires good policies, good programs, and a very strong workforce. I was on a call on Monday with a bunch of technical center, academic institutions, legislators, and contractors, the associated general contractors, who are thinking about what's the workforce look like for the state of Vermont in the weatherization sector. And that's the conversation we're having with the Middlebury team too, is how do we build a very robust workforce, putting people to work in these jobs. And we need good skills and good training and good on-ramps, and we need to diversify the people that we are bringing into these spaces. And that really, I think, is working with a lot of different players. And I want to give props to Senator Keisha Ram too, who has really been leading this effort to identify the diversification and the expansion of programs like the core program, like a climate core model or a CCC model, to look at how do we put people who bear the greatest energy burden and bear the brunt of the climate crisis, and that is the people of color and lower income Vermonters, and how do we better serve them and help put them to work in those jobs so that they gain financial independence and and they're getting the benefits of reduced reliance on fossil fuels. So there's a massive landscape out there of different partners in the state of Vermont. It's very exciting, and how we sync all of this up, informed by the work of the Middlebury students in answering what is a climate core, what that could look like, is really exciting. And I just really, again, just want to look at it through the opportunity frame and support sort of federal policy and good state programs and policies that drive the transition at the scale that's required.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks for that, Joey, and excellent summary. And again, building on so many good years of work you and your colleagues have done up there. I'm looking at the clock, and we have just under 20 minutes, and we'll end on time. So I'm thankful to folks who are still with us and learning from each other. I'm going to offer something from one of our attendees, Leslie Canott, who makes the point that one of the great policies out there that has held promise for 2 decades or more is carbon fee and dividend. And there's a version of that, cap and dividend. But the basic idea is that you get the prices right in terms of internalizing that negative externality, and then just give that money back to individuals. And there's a lot of people who champion that from all parts of the political spectrum, I might add. Leslie has us is asking us to visit online energyinnovationact.org, so one word, energyinnovationact.org, where we can learn about this, the adoption of HR 2307, which has been introduced last week by Congressman Deutsch to do this very thing. As an economist who teaches every year about internalizing externalities and the importance of taxes to do so, I couldn't agree more. It's quite interesting that the stubbornness of any kind of tax persists as it has ever since the Reagan era, where the Biden people therefore have really pivoted to infrastructure and spending, public investments, as a way to really get this locomotive going. But I'm in full agreement with you there, Leslie. We have also a question about education. Sam Lash has us to think about something that is on our minds a lot at Middlebury, that climate change challenges us as individuals, psychologically, intellectually, practically, right? It's a liberal arts kind of challenge is the way we view it. And Sam brings in the idea of social framing, as Kate has talked about. And the point being here that education is so important. And public schools are stressed, I'm paraphrasing here. So what can the state be doing to implement climate, environmental, sustainable policies, training programs, support, etc.? And that gets to the heart of Solve Climate by 2030. What Eben is really trying to do, as you got a sense from his video, is to mobilize high school teachers, students coming up into colleges to make that change. So I don't know if any of you want to address that. It's a big question. It's one we should all be thinking about, and I'll open it up to our panelists. What should we be doing on the education front, maybe that we're not doing now, in light of our hopes and dreams for getting to 2030?
So if I step outside my EAN hat, until January, I was the executive director of the Vermont Energy Education Program, which does do energy and climate education across K-12 schools throughout Vermont and New Hampshire. And that education tends to be very science-based, because I think that you're right. It is a social science issue. It's also a science issue. We need to be training the next crew of technicians and problem solvers in the science and engineering realm, as well as social sciences. We need everybody. We need all hands on deck, and we need people to get engaged wherever they are inspired. Really, this is a problem that is a problem of our whole lifetime, so we need to find the places to engage wherever we're inspired. I do think that the school systems are opening up spaces for students to take on things that are their passion projects. I'm very inspired by the youth lobby. And again, I'm not talking with my EAN hat right now, but just my former work hat. But there are students across the state of Vermont who have come together to really make their voices heard, and they're doing really great work in that regard. So I see a lot of positive things happening actually in the education sphere, and I see a lot of young people who are very inspired to make change and to go forward. I would also love to know if Kate has an answer to that question as well.
Yeah, two things I was kind of thinking of. The first being the importance of climate literacy, because I think that teaching students and teaching kids from a young age about climate change is really important. Like for me, I didn't learn about climate change until my junior year of high school, and that was through like an independent project. Like it was in no way integrated into my curriculum. And then I didn't really fully understand the caliber, I guess, of climate change until coming to Middlebury and taking environmental studies classes. But that's not to say that like environmental consciousness like wasn't there in my upbringing. Like I'm thinking back to like, you know, learning about recycling, or like we would have like a bike or a walk to school day. And like, it's great to have those, but it's equally important that kids and students understand why, because I think a lot of good growth can come from teaching the why, and teaching kids from a young age how to, you know, be stewards of the earth and how to like interact with their surroundings, and you know, what does it mean to stand on the land that they're standing on. The second thing I will add really briefly is climate communication. I think is also super important. And that's like a skill, and that's a tool that needs to be developed and like constantly worked at, and like I'm still working at it. And I think it's a very curious problem in Vermont, I would say, because we do exist in this like Vermont bubble, if you will, where, you know, not everyone is growing up in a state where there are laws enforcing composting. And on the one hand, like it's so great that Vermont is pretty, you know, environmentally progressive in that sense. But where that kind of comes to bite us maybe a little bit is on the climate communication front, where you know, once kids here like escape that bubble, like it can be rather jarring. And so it's jarring in the sense of running into conversations with, you know, like how to phrase this, how might you communicate to somebody who's never composted before, who doesn't know what composting is, or who like how do you explain carbon fee and dividend, those kind of things, and like explain like, you know, why it's important. And I just think it's super helpful to be equipped not only with the facts to engage in those conversations, but to also kind of develop those tools to understand how best to communicate those ideas and those facts, because you know, not everyone is operating under, not everyone has the same upbringing. Yeah.
And you even mentioned it this morning, Kate, in class, your group had some questions for some of the migrant workers that were distinctions between home and house, if I recall, and it just didn't fit with the way they view it. And it sounded also like that you quickly saw that it was better to kind of let them lead with their language, if you will. And so that was a good example. You know, the scholars of social change talk about keeping an eye on 3 pillars: getting organized, looking for political opportunities, and then framing. And so they put communication up there with the other 2 as critical. And if we think of all the great movements of our time and before that, that framing, that communication has been so fundamental. Sarah Evans has asked a question, and then Joey, I see her hand up, but I just want to reiterate that Sarah has a good question here about what students can do. And I think you've just begun to hear. You were wondering about your high school. You're doing some good work, it sounds like, with your town's electric department, energy committee. What is your best advice for students to do more? Education, outreach, volunteering, all of the above, I would say, because everything matters. Something I would throw in, because of the intimacy of Vermont politics, is get a hold of your elected representatives, your members of your member of the House, your senator, who may well live down the road, and you may know them already. And they're in the mix. Ask them what they're doing. Find an issue within this that you really care about, whether it's justice or transportation, or the list goes on, and hold them to it. and these are good people up there. And so that's something I would add to your good list. In a moment, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and bring in one of the great thinkers on climate in this state, and that is Alan Betts, who joined us last year in a similarly quasi-spontaneous way. And Alan, as you're going to hear, as we begin to round the bend, it always has wisdom to bring from his perspective as an atmospheric researcher. But Joey, I saw your hand was up, so I wanted to give you a chance to offer some thoughts.
And it's likely to be a perfect segue to Alan, in fact, which I would just say to Kate's point, which I certainly echo, framing matters, climate communications matter. I think that people are motivated by, their lived experience, and that's where we need to meet people. And people are motivated by their values and what they are experiencing. I just took my 9-year-old daughter, Lila, for a walk before this, and we're coming down through the woods, and I ran into a neighbor a little bit far away, and her forsythia was blooming. It's just glorious. And I was commenting and oohing and ahhing on it. And she's like, yeah, usually is blooming in, early to mid-May. My peonies are this high already. I mean, I'm curious, Kate, I'd be very curious to hear from you, and we're not going to get into it now, but the migrant workers, like people who are in the dirt and living their lives, are witnessing changes. I'm not going to draw a direct correlation to climate, but I do think they are connected. Our seasons are coming earlier. And this is an opportunity, I think, to talk to people about the change we are witnessing here in the state of Vermont. Pulling a tick off my daughter 3 weeks ago when the snow is still on the ground. Like, we are witnessing a massive transformation that's going to have serious consequences. And this is a moment in time to, I think, meet people in a way that, they're recognizing, they're seeing these changes. They are connected. I'm going to pivot to Alan because he knows this better than anyone else as a climate scientist, but it is real out there on the land.
Yeah, well put. Thanks, Joey. With Zoom technology permitting, we're going to welcome Alan, who many of you know out of his home in Pittsford, is a wonderful atmospheric researcher, and even more so, just a wise citizen and a thoughtful person who sometimes signs his emails and letters with just the sign off, which is love. And I appreciate that, Alan, so much about you. And from somewhere up in the universe, we welcome you for some thoughts as we finish up.
Thank you. And I can't possibly do much except throw a few things out in a few minutes here. Perspective. I've been a scientist, a climate scientist, and concerned about the Earth for 50 years. 50 years ago, I knew that science was not enough because it lacks wisdom, it lacks a view, and it is terribly abusive with power. Like the whole of our society has this fetish with power that goes all the way back to the Greeks. And I had no idea how fundamental that was. It's completely contrasts with the indigenous people's view, the Blue River Declaration, if you want just a snapshot of that, thinking in terms of the ethics of the earth. We don't do that at all. The climate crisis has got to a point where we have to change our mindset here, because the earth is not paying any attention to our treatment of power. The only way you can communicate with the earth, and I will say, because our society doesn't do this, the earth is not a passive part subjected to our power, not in the least bit. The only way you can communicate and understand the earth is to surrender to it. And that we don't do. Never, never surrender is our attitude, because we are warfare and power oriented. And this problem can't be solved within that framework. So the issues that raised, the issue that you raised, Kate, of trust, absolutely fundamental. But you have to be able to trust in the earth itself. The earth is not passive in this. The first time I was carried away sitting in some room in India, I had no idea when I was connected to everything that is where I was going. I had no idea you could sit in a place and actually be carried off into another world. But the second thing I want to say is, and I will preface this with saying that everything we are doing in Vermont and you are doing is critical. But there's a dark side behind it, which is why in the past 30 or 40 years, we have not solved this problem, that we also need to understand. And again, I had really no idea until I read a book by Michael Mann just a few months ago and wrote something about it. And that is, Exxon knew 40 years ago. For the first 20 years, they simply suppressed climate change denial. And they're still doing that. I was stunned even this week to discover it costs them only $61 million to buy 139 Republican climate change deniers in Congress who will stand up and lie and say for their $500,000 each that climate change is all a hoax. Well, you know that attitude. But the darker side is I didn't realize that what I'm now calling the fossil empire, which is all the people working with the fossil companies and the businesses, how they had managed to control us too, for the last 20 years. And they did it by what's called deflection. What they want, and we still haven't got, I heard mention of it again, and we'll see as Biden tries to push this through, we have never got an economic cost on fossil fuels because the people involved, the fossil empire, has made sure we never get it. That's the one thing they don't want. And one of the ways they were able to do that is what's called deflection, is to shift the frame to the issue of personal responsibility. And on the issue of personal responsibility, business does this all the time. I didn't realize that. But in this frame, there actually a lot of the information that has been fed our way in the last 20 years has been tinkered with by the oil companies like Russia and in Saudi Arabia, and Exxon and all its people, tinkered with to encourage us to view this as an individual problem, which we have to solve individually and at the state level. And absolutely, we need to do that. But their purpose is to take attention away from what we need to do as a nation and as a planet, which is put a real cost on fossil fuel so that the economic system we live in, which is capitalism, will shift away and make it cheaper. I wrote so you have to cut me off at this point because it's coming up.
Well, no, I think that, you know, I really just appreciate the urgency of what you say. The fact that none of us should be naive, as you say, Exxon knew, and it's a point that we can't overlook, even those of us who've been in the trenches to some degree, that it is about power. And, you know, when Bill McKibben talks about changing the zeitgeist, it's not just about some of the things that we're talking about here, but it's a whole way of seeing what politics is for, what political power is for. And that is as urgent as anything. So I know that you have a paper that has just come out in an open source journal called Climate Change in Society, and I trust that can be found online. I commend it to you all, and you can hear the passion as well as the experience that Alan brings to our state and more broadly. And again, I will speak for myself. I'm a glass half full person, and those of us in that category can sometimes be naive. And we mustn't be naive, even as we do the work, as you say, at the local level. So I appreciate that so much. I do want to honor our time. And a good number of you who started are still with us, which is great. Spread the word that this is being recorded so it can be shared asynchronously. And, you know, the conversation goes on. I trust that whether it's Fran and Spence Putnam doing their good work in Weybridge, or our colleagues at Champlain College who are still with us, Ariel Simpson, who didn't get a chance to speak up, but I know doing good work up there, my old pal in the climate movement, Doug Grant, now in Putney, students, Ellie Packard is here, several others, and my colleague, Frank Gesbeck, Middlebury professor of the practice. You're a great group who's still with us, and this social change will come about through your hard work, those day-to-day interactions where we listen, slow down a bit, and then in time take action. And the three of you, our panelists, represent that so well. So I always like to end a class by offering the students the final word. And so I'd like to do that now. After I repeat my gratitude to the Franklin Environmental Center at Hillcrest. Janet, thanks a million for pulling this together alongside Jack Byrne. Danielle Madison, thank you so much for making this all work technically. Thanks all to the panelists and the participants. And now for that final word, I open it up to our three panelists for their own reflection or wisdom as we finish up.
I'm going to defer to Kate and just say thank you. I need to end this note. Beyond the optimism you just brought, John, and the urgency you brought, Alan, I'm going to channel the Kate power and bring it into my day tomorrow and my weeks moving forward. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot of work ahead of us. There's a lot for us to do, and I think it's inspiring, and it's inspiring when we think about it in community. I love the framing you put on that, Kate, as we started out. So I also would like to pass it to you for the final words.
Wow, thank you, everyone. Yeah, well, thank you, John, for putting this on, and Cara and Joanna. It's such an honor to like be on this panel with you guys. But yeah, I mean, it's no easy task. What we have coming our way, but there's so much hope to be found. And I think it's in conversations like this and in events like this that are just super inspiring, where you can get together with people and just talk about, okay, like what can we actually do? And pulling people from different areas, you know, talking about transportation, jobs, housing. You know, you can't solve climate change just focusing on one of those areas. And so I think it's just so cool and so great to really pull everything together and kind of, you know, take a glass half full look at this, because climate change can be doom and gloom, but there's always hope to be found. And yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.